we're going to tell the story today. So if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what that song even means, join the club, because nobody in this room knows what that song means right now, because we don't know the story behind it. This song, actually, it reminded me a lot of the songs that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in his Lord of the Rings novels. Does anybody like J.R.R. Tolkien? I'm just gonna, okay, we got a couple of nerds in the house. Thank you very much. But he writes a lot of songs in his work, and they're poetry, and it really, this one sings a lot like a Tolkien tune. Doesn't sing like a Kenny Chesney tune, that's for sure. It sings more like a J.R.R. Tolkien tune. And the story behind this is interesting. But before we dive into the story, I want to tell you a story about something else that happened. Back in 1915, it was a tragedy, an utter tragedy. And it was called the Boston Molasses Flood of 1915. This is a true story. I found it this week. Somebody's already heard this story. This is good. The Boston Molasses Flood of 1915 happened. And here's actually a picture of the aftermath of the Boston Molasses Flood. Now you're thinking to yourself, like molasses, like the stuff I use to bake with? Yes, that sticky, brown, gooey substance. That's what we're talking about here. There was an explosion at a plant down in Boston that blew up a vat of molasses, sending tens of thousands of gallons of molasses into the neighborhoods. I don't even like it when it gets on the rim. Y'all, I'm like trying to squeeze the bottle, turn the bottle back on. Molasses is one of those things that you buy once your entire life, and then you never need it again, right? Like you have a bottle of molasses in your cupboard from 40 years ago. I'm guaranteeing you that. Now, unless you just make a lot of molasses cookies all the time, it's not something that you go to. When you turn that cap off, it's like you gotta uncement it. It's like super glue. If you don't wipe the tip when you're done, you ain't getting that back open again, ever again. You're done. You might as well buy a new bottle, right? Like molasses is like that. It's like the sticky, gooey stuff. Now imagine that much molasses. How much molasses are we talking? 2,300,000 gallons of molasses. That's a lot of molasses, y'all. Like that. Can you imagine that? My swimming pool is 32 by 16 and holds 15,000 gallons. So your average swimming pool is about 15 to 20,000 gallons. We're talking 2,300,000 gallons of molasses that flooded an entire neighborhood and flattened. I mean, that's a lot. It sounds a little comical, but it wreaked a lot of havoc. People died in this thing. Like, how'd you die? I drowned in molasses. How in the world? That's interesting. So it was 2,300,000. This is the actual huge molasses tank explodes in North End, 11 dead, 50 hurt. That's how much gallons. And it was a 25-foot wave tsunami of molasses that was moving at 35 miles an hour. Okay, so I can't run that fast, y'all. Like I can barely run to the kitchen for a sandwich these days. I don't think I can outrun a 25-foot tidal wave of molasses moving at 35 miles an hour. Like this is gonna be some, I'm just a goner if I'm close by. And it weighed about 12,000 tons of molasses. So this is a big, sticky, messy problem. And you're probably wondering, like, how did this happen? Here's another picture. It took out a train bridge, like a bridge that went over, and it took out the train bridge. I can't remember what those are called, but it just like swept everything out from underneath it. That just knocked it right on over. So they're wondering, how did this happen? Everyone always asks, how does this happen after a tragedy hits, even when it's just molasses? How did it happen? Well, one, it was poor construction of the vat. So the vat was held together with rivets, and the rivets are supposed to hold it together, and it's stronger than a weld. That's why they, rivet together airplanes and boats. You don't weld those things because temperature fluctuations don't like the welding, and they tend to crack and snap. Well, the rivets that they used were not very good, and they had rust immediately that set in. Somehow, somewhere, rust got in from the beginning before they even filled the thing with molasses. So that happened. It was rusty stuff got in the middle of it. You can tell I'm an engineer, right? Rusty stuff. Rusty stuff is in there. And that weakened the seams. And when it exploded, they said that it sounded like a machine gun going off because the rivets were all popping at a rapid pace. So it sounded like a machine gun, and then there was an explosion as the thing burst open, and 2,300,000 gallons went through. So that was one thing that happened, was poor construction, temperature fluctuation. This happened on January, I believe 15th, if I remember my date correctly. It happened in January. And that day in January, it went from 2 degrees in the morning to 42 degrees pretty quickly. Now, if you make things hot and cold rapidly, there's fluctuation in size. I don't know if you've ever poured your cup of coffee and come back and it's like lower. You're like, oh, I forgot about my coffee. Who drank some coffee? It just cooled off. It got a little shorter. That happens. My coffee down here is starting to cool off. And it leaves like a little line. It's like, oh, it was here when it was hot, but now it's down here when it's cool. So there was a rapid, and they also like heated the molasses to put in because it flows better at certain temperatures. So they had to heat that. They put it in. Outside was cold. Outside temperature raised up quickly. That also caused fluctuation in size of the molasses, and it was not a good thing. And internal corrosion. So these three things combined led to the explosion of a vat of 2 million gallons of molasses that then flooded an entire neighborhood in, I think they said, up to 2 feet of molasses. So I don't know if you've ever walked through molasses before. I've not had the pleasure of doing that myself, but I'm sure it was not very pleasurable. It took weeks and weeks and weeks to clean up, as I'm sure, like it takes me a good hour to clean off the bottle and the cap. So I can't imagine an entire neighborhood covered in molasses. But the event entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Oh, Lord have mercy. You go there into Boston on that port on a hot summer day, and it's going to smell like molasses. How did it happen? Corroded from the inside, and some other things. But we want to hone in on that corrosion of the inside first, because that is where we're going in today's part of the story. Now, if you noticed, this song that was a part of our passage out of 2 Samuel was a song that was dedicated to Saul because he died. Let's do a quick recap of Saul. Who was Saul? Now remember, we're in the Old Testament, and this is a really old book, so it reads weird. There's stuff in there that we just, we don't do that anymore. We don't do it like that anymore, but they're back in the Iron Age and Bronze Age, y'all, so it's like really old stuff. We're not meant to just pull morality out of the Old Testament and slap it on our t-shirts and say, oh, well, the Bible says this. We're meant to look at the narrative itself and say, what is the story trying to tell us? What wisdom can we pull from this? What is it communicating to us? So we don't have to say, oh, wow, look, God lied in the story of 1 Samuel. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. Does that mean that God lies? No, it's just how they are telling the story back in the day. God doesn't actually lie. So we have to be very careful reading the Old Testament because there's weird things in there. And sometimes the Old Testament will condone in a passage what it condemns in the whole narrative, because we have to keep our eyes on the story. So that means we're looking at the story. Who is Saul? Well, in 1 Samuel 8, we talked about in our very first week, he's the guy that was appointed king. They were a tribal nation. They didn't have a leadership structure. They were just a bunch of tribes, and then they decided, well, we want a king. And so they appointed Saul to be their king because he was head and shoulders above everybody else. Now, if you remember, in that moment there is a rejection of God. It wasn't just, hey, we want a king and that'd be cool, but God was supposed to be their king and fight their battles for them. And they said, we don't want that anymore. We would like Saul instead to be our king and to fight our battles for us. So that was everything that happens after that moment in this story is God trying to redeem the plan. Because everything's going wrong since that moment. Everything is just going to fall apart since that moment. Because that is a moment Just like in Genesis 2, eating the forbidden fruit kind of a thing, and then everything else from there like falls apart. This is another version. Or the golden calf in Exodus, everything from there falls apart. We have another moment just like that in 1 Samuel 8. Everything from that moment falls apart. It doesn't stay good. So they pick Saul. He does a pretty good job for like a chapter, and then just messes everything up for like the rest of the book. He's not a very good king at all. But this moment is the people rejecting God, asking for a king. Saul is chosen, but he falls twice. He fails big time twice, right in the first couple of chapters after he was anointed. One of them was he was supposed to wait for Samuel, who was kind of the religious leader of the day, to come and do the religious ceremony to bless what they're about to go do in warfare, which is also a weird thing in the Old Testament. And Saul's like, oh, he's not here, I'll do it. And he does it, and then Samuel shows up, and he's like, Tommy boy, what'd you do? Like, you were supposed to do that. I was supposed to do that. And so it's said in that moment that the kingdom is taken from Saul. But guess what? He remains king for the rest of the book, even though it says that he's taken from him. But then David, God sends Samuel, the religious leader, he sends him on a covert mission into the city to find David, anoint him king instead of Saul. And he does that. He shows up in this small little village. He's like, all right, I'm looking for somebody to anoint as new king. And so they bring all these people, none of them are him. They find David watching some sheep, and he's like, that's the guy. So anoint him as king. And Saul's rejected as king. David is now anointed as king. But if you notice, the whole book, David isn't acting as king at all. And Saul is not giving up being king for the whole book. It's like a really awkward thing. David actually becomes Saul's attendant. So Saul is stricken with like mental illness. He's depressed. He's got some struggles mentally where he's just up and down. And David is trying to cheer him up by playing music. And so Saul tries to kill David by throwing a spear at him and pinning him to the wall as he's playing his harp. So that moment happens. But remember the David and Goliath story. That's when David shows up and Goliath is like, it's a whole battle that's supposed to take place, and Goliath is just, he's being a jerk and taunting everybody. But David becomes a hero when he defeats Goliath. And everybody loves David. They're just like, oh my gosh, this David guy is like the best thing ever. And they came up with a song that they sang. And this probably like poked King Saul a little bit. But their song that they sang was, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Now, if you can just imagine somebody who has a high position of leadership, and then somebody comes in and does a better job at your job, and then they start singing that person's praises, and then that person is like, I don't like this person. And that's when he tries to kill him. So it sets up this bitter rivalry that happens for the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. And this is the moment when Saul attempts murder. After the people start singing David's praises over him. Like it's actually in the song they're singing. Like, yeah, Saul's slain his thousands, but David is slain his tens of thousands. Now, again, this is not meant to glorify war or violence or anything like that. It's just the result of a tribalistic people of the Iron Age, Bronze Age period. So it's not meant to glorify war and battle. It's meant to be more like read as a story, like you're watching like Game of Thrones or Braveheart or Gladiator or something like that. We don't want to emulate that stuff, but there's a story that's being told. So Saul attempts murder. David is playing his instrument of choice, and he's like singing for Saul and playing for Saul, and Saul's like, I like this. No, I don't like this. And he picks up his spear, and he tries to throw it at David. He's like, he gets it in his head. He's like, I'm going to pin him to the wall. Because this guy is like, everyone loves him, and I need to take him out. So he throws his spear and misses David. Here's an actual photo I found of that moment. David is just like, I cannot even with Saul anymore. I cannot even. So Saul, that is not an actual photo, because David was not white. So Saul pursues David for 10 chapters. David has to run away. He's the anointed king of the people of Israel, but he has to live with the Philistines and like hang out with them for 5 to 7 years. So chapters 20 through 30 are like a period of 5 to 7 years where he is just running away from Saul, constantly being pursued, being hunted. He's after him, and Saul is like living in caves and tents in the wilderness, trying to like evade the manhunt and the search that's after him. But the interesting thing is Saul is like violently pursuing to kill David, try and find him. Well, David happens to come upon a cave. And who's inside the cave? Relieving himself. Yes, the Bible has that in there too. Saul, King Saul's in there, hanging out going to the bathroom, and David sneaks up on him and steals his spear. Walks out. And it says that he could have killed King Saul in that moment, but chose not to. That's really important for our story. David could have killed King Saul in the cave. But you don't do that to a man who's going to the bathroom. Don't even knock on the door, right? So, it's in the Bible, I can talk about it. So he steals his spear and takes off. And Saul is like, oh, David is so like amazing because he could have killed me and he didn't. So, since he's so amazing, I'm going to have to kill him. And he keeps pursuing him and pursuing him. And one day, David comes in, he finds Saul again. And he's sleeping. And so what he does is he sneaks up on Saul. And instead of killing Saul in this moment, he could end the manhunt and seize the throne in this one moment if he wanted to. But he doesn't. He cuts off the corner of his robe and runs. Is that weird or what? Like, I'm just going to cut off part of your clothes and say bye. And then Saul wakes up and he notices that it's missing. And he's like, oh, it was David. I know it was David. Interesting fun fact. What is at the corner of someone in Jewish authority? What is at the corner of their robe? Oh. See, this is the fun part of the Bible. If you don't dive into the culture, sometimes you miss it. It's like, oh, he cut off a corner of the robe and took off. Oh, that's really interesting. But he cut off a certain piece of the man's robe. Now, as a Jewish man, he would have been required under Numbers 15 to have worn a prayer shawl over top of his garment. That would have been also called his robe. And at the corners of this prayer shawl would have been like these little tassels that dangle down. And in the Hebrew, they're called tzitzis. T-zit, T-zit. That's how it's not pronounced that way, but that's how it's spelled. These are things that, they're like 5 beads that hang that symbolize the law of God given, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first 5 books called the law. Very important to a Hebrew person. They call that the law. This is God's gift to us humans. Which I wouldn't look at the book of Leviticus and say that's a God's gift to humans, because I've tried to read that book and it's not very interesting. Just to let you know. You can skip that one if you want to. Go to Jesus. So he cuts off the corner of that robe that contains, like, you have violated God's law with the way you lead. So he sent a message. He didn't just cut a corner and run. He sent a message saying to Saul, like, this isn't going to last much longer because you are not living the way that you should. So David refuses all opportunity to seize power away from Saul, fearing that it would do to his soul what it did to Saul's. This is the key point here in this story. Saul has gone sour. Saul has corroded from the inside. Saul has just unleashed like 2,300,000 gallons of molasses on the people and made a big mess of everything. And so you know what Saul does? He says, you know what? I need to talk to Samuel. There's a problem with that. Samuel's dead. How you talk to somebody who's dead? Saul goes to a fortune teller. He's like, all right, I need to talk to Samuel. I know the guy's dead, but I think you can reach this guy. And so this portion is called the fortune teller of Endor. If you're a fan of Star Wars, it's not talking the moon of Endor with Ewoks on it. This is just the witch of Endor, or I don't know what the Hebrew term is, but it's like the fortune teller of Endor. So this fortune teller is like, all right, let me see if I can reach him. I'll give him a ring. And she does her fortune telling thing. Guess who shows up? Samuel shows up. Dead Samuel. He shows up and he's like, what are you trying to call me for? I'm dead. Like, let me be dead, guys. Like, I just need some rest. I've been looking after all y'all for a long time and I'm tired and I just want to be dead. That's not exactly the quote from the Hebrew, but it's close. But it was also forbidden in the Jewish law to do this practice. So Samuel's just like, I can't believe you're like trying to reach me even though I'm dead, and you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to be doing this method. So Saul's like, I just need to know what to do. You got to tell me what to do. And Samuel then says, oh, here's what's going to happen. You're going to die. The throne will be ripped from you, and you're going to die. Bye. I'm going to go be dead now. And he leaves. So Saul is just like, well, crap. Like, I'm going to die, and the throne is going to be ripped from my family. Because the monarchy, it passes to your sons and your sons and your sons and all that kind of stuff. And they're saying, nope, it ain't going to happen to you at all. Howard Thurman, one of my favorite theologians, he says, David's patience and refusal to take Saul's life highlights the strength found in humility and the peril of letting power corrupt the soul. That could have happened in this moment, but he didn't. So then war breaks out. This is fun. And makes me think of the Temptation song, War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Right? That's a great song. So there's a war that breaks out between the Israelites and the Philistines, and they are battling it up. And guess who dies? Jonathan does. Saul's son, Jonathan, which David and Jonathan had a very special relationship together. They colluded to save David's life a couple of times when Jonathan knew about his dad's plan to kill him, and he was like, you got to run, man, because he's after you. So they colluded against his own father. Well, Jonathan ends up dying in this battle. And Saul ends up getting shot with arrows. So here's Saul. He's like pierced with arrows. And the approaching army is coming. And what do they do with kings when they capture them? They have a lot of violent, nasty sport with them. So Saul is like, well, this ain't happening. He turns to the guy who carries his shield. It's called an armor bearer. And he's like, take your sword and kill me. And the armor bearer's like, I ain't doing that, man. I am not. No, I cannot do that. And so Saul, he's like, fine. And he grabs his sword and he puts it to his chest and he leans on it and he just falls right into it. Takes his own life right there. Saul is dead. And then the armor bearer's looking at him. He's like, look at Saul, looks at the approaching army. He's like, I think I'm going to do the same. He dies. Falls on his sword. That's what the term fall on his sword means. Put it against your chest, and then you just literally drop. So both of them are dead. The Philistines show up, and they're like, oh, they're dead. So they take Saul's body, and they still have the sport. They start to this is a little gross, but they nailed it to a wall on a city to kind of display. Because they did like gross things back in the day. Sometimes they still do today. But it was like, my reaction was like, ew, David, gross. Have you never seen that show? I'm sorry. Saul's remains are desecrated in chapter 31. And it's just like, it's kind of gross. You don't have to look at that part. You don't have to. Because it is kind of, David didn't do it, by the way. David did not do it. I just thought that was funny myself. So these people from a city called Jabesh Gilead, they're like, nuh-uh, we are going and we are taking his body off that wall and we'll give him a proper burial. And they did that. Why did these guys do that? Why would the people from Jabesh Gilead care? Because if you remember, way back in Saul's very first thing that he did good was he rescued the people from the Amalekites. Remember those people? They're like, we'll surrender to you. Yes, you have a bigger army than us, so we will surrender. They're like, okay, that means that we're going to have to pluck out the right eye of everyone in your town. They're like, can we think about this? So they start sending someone come save us. Saul comes to their rescue. So they remembered that. And here it is a decade later, maybe even longer. Could be 2 decades later. They remembered that and they said, no, we're not going to let them desecrate Saul's body like that because we remember what he did for us. And they take his body down off the wall and they give it a proper burial. Well, then this guy comes, now we're in 2 Samuel, by the way. So this guy comes up before David. And he's like, all right, give me the news of the battle. You're a messenger. Give me the news of the battle. He's like, well, we have Jonathan's dead. And David's like, oh, that sucks. And then they said, also, Saul is dead. How do you know that Saul's dead? And the Amalekite says this. He's like, I killed him for you. Oh, now this is interesting here. Because there's a change in books. In 1 Samuel, the end of it, it tells us how he died. He fell on his sword, and he died because he was shot with arrows. And he's like, I'm going to die, I'm going to fall on my sword, and he dies. The Amalekite comes with a totally different story, 2 Samuel, and he says, well, I came across him, he was wounded in battle, and so I decided to kill him for you. I did that. So here's David's recorded response. Kill him, Bill. I don't know if the guy's name was Bill. I just like the name Bill. There's Bill. Bill, I love you. So it was just like, kill him. So they actually killed the Amalekite. They're like, no, actually. And David says this, you didn't think twice about killing God's anointed person, God's anointed king? It's like, excuse me, David, who was anointed king 20 years ago at this point? It was David. But he says, I refuse to seize that control for myself. I refuse to do that. And so he had a chance to kill David twice. This Amalekite shows up and he's like, oh, I bet if I claim that I killed Saul for David, he will shower me with blessings and promotions. And David is just like, nope, you're going to die now. And so he was killed. So an interesting point is revenge. David knows that revenge has a corrupting influence upon the soul. And David is going to reject that temptation of claiming revenge. He says, no, I'm not going to do it. Not going to claim revenge and seize the power. Even though he's already been anointed king 20 years ago and the people love him, he chooses to run and hide and stay in caves and not kill Saul. He just stays there. And Walter Brueggemann says this, the narrative of Saul and David is a powerful exploration of the effects of power on the human soul. Saul's descent into paranoia and violence contrasts sharply with David's restraint and humility, underscoring the necessity of self-awareness and moral integrity in leadership. So there's a lot of killing in this story. There's a lot of killing in the Old Testament. Doesn't mean that we glorify the killing that is there. We're supposed to pull the things out that are interesting to us today. And this is something that we're supposed to pull out. Someone says, well, isn't it interesting that, it's a little contradictory to say that we're not going to pursue revenge, but then David has somebody ordered killed. It's like, yes, it is contradictory. But in the value system of the day, we have to look at the message being communicated. It's not communicating the morals that we're supposed to do. None of us are going to go and be like, okay, I'll order him dead and all that kind of stuff. It's not how we're supposed to be, but we're supposed to say, what's the narrative telling us? And pull that stuff out. And so we finally come to today's passage, the Song of the Bow. It's interesting that this David somehow knew this Amalekite was lying because he said, I killed him. And he's like, no, actually, I know for a fact that he was killed by the bow and arrow. It wasn't you. So Saul died from this bow and arrow attack. David knew the truth somehow. And he writes an entire song about Saul. And he says, I want every single person in the entire nation to sing this song called the Song of the Bow. And everyone has to learn this song. And is there a bunch of stuff in there about, and then he pursued me, and then he this is David's time to steer the story towards himself and make him look good. And David instead chooses to remember the good things that Saul did do. In fact, there was only about a chapter of it, and sing those things. And he actually overlooks a lot of the horrible things that he did. And he says, you know what? We need to grieve and lament the loss of our king, Saul. So even in Saul's death, David does not dehumanize Saul into his bad decisions or his evil traits. He doesn't write them off because I'm sure he was pursued for 22 years by Saul. He doesn't write them off, but he chooses not to diminish Saul to his bad decisions that he made. He chooses to still humanize him and sing a song about him. And then he recounts the goodness that was there in his life, writes a song about it, and then makes space for all the people to grieve with him. I thought that was just an amazing story that talks about the integrity of David in this moment. And I like St. Maximus the Confessor said this, the life of David teaches us that power, when sought for its own sake, leads to spiritual destruction. It is only through humility and obedience to God that one can wield authority without falling into sin. That was a long time ago he wrote that, and I think it's still true today. And so our reflection today, a couple questions, or a couple of things. Never idolize people in positions of or pathways to power. Never idolize those things, because guess what? Authority and power will be given to people. It's going to happen. But when we idolize people in positions of or pathways to those power sources, it has a corrupting influence on our souls. The second thing, the things you have to do to get, keep, and wield power will corrode from the inside out, and you will unleash 2,300,000 gallons of molasses on your neighborhood. So if you are obsessed with getting, keeping, and wielding power, it corrodes you from the inside out. That's one of the things that we learn from this passage. So our question there is, where do I do this in life today? I think we all do this because we all have to deal with power, whether it is given to us or handed to us or we got it somehow. Everybody's going to have to deal with power. And if we don't have the integrity to hold it, then we do damage to ourselves and our communities around us. And so here's closing thought. Sometimes power comes to you. What will you do with it? Sometimes it comes to you. What will you do with it? Our benediction today is Psalm 130. And it is retold by modern-day psalmist Malcolm Guite in sonnet form. And it says this: ask him for mercy, you won't be denied. Call on him out of the depths from the deep, the places where the child in you has cried all night unheard, and where your spirit weeps, as Rachel wept and would not be consoled. Cry from the places where grief unspoken seeps into bitter silence, never told and never healed. So cry out from the deep. Bring every grief to God. Do not withhold a tear from him. Give him your tears to keep, for they are precious to him. Flee to him. His heart was pierced, and he knows how to weep, for he is full of mercy. And with him is plenteous redemption. Let him sound the depths, that he might draw you out from them. Psalm 130, retold by Malcolm Guite.